So what can we learn from Argentina's Payment for Ecosystem Service program? And I know that during this new Zoom face thing, a lot of people spend their time just zoning out, and that's completely okay. And if you do that, just take a screenshot of this, and you will see the two titles of the papers that we just got out. And my whole presentation is based on those two papers. So if you just want to, have lunch and do something else, you can just take a screenshot, read those papers later or not. But everything can be found there. So feel free to just read them. The first paper actually was one of my dissertation chapters, the ecosystem services one. And then the land use is a continuation of that work that we started about a year after we graduated, and you can see some familiar names there as well. But so the overarching question, I would say, that inspired me or sort of made me think of these research topics was, how can we secure long-term forest conservation in private lands, right? Because if you think of forest conservation and you think of the way our world is today, we have a huge biodiversity crisis, climate change. I mean, you all know that. You don't need me to tell you that. But then the challenge becomes, at least in my opinion, how do we do conservation in private lands? Because if we have public lands, there's at least a possibility that you can turn those into protected areas. Well, even in private lands too. But you would need a few extra steps. So is there a way to do conservation in private lands that is actually successful and that allows us to secure conservation over the long term? And one of the strategies that emerge sometimes is market-based strategies, right? And the most common example are payment for ecosystem service programs. Has anybody heard about payment for ecosystems services? Do you all know what it is? Can someone take a stab at maybe giving us a definition or what they think when they hear that word?
Yeah, payments for ecosystem services are payments generally given to landowners for ecosystem services such as biodiversity conservation or water filtration, or other things that their lands are expected to be producing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're hitting a lot of important points. And as a matter of fact, payment for ecosystem service programs are so used nowadays. This is an estimation for 2017. Each year, we are investing anywhere between $36 and $42 billion each year. So that's a lot of money to be investing in a strategy for long-term conservation. And just like Joanna said, I think that was you, Joanna, right? Yes. Okay, so yeah, so we have a group of people here and this could be a group of people, or it could be a government representing these people that are interested in some sort of ecosystem service that is owned by another group of people. And now this group of people will offer payments, voluntary payments, to the owners of the land that provides this service in exchange for that continued provision, right? And so if the owners are interested, they would enroll in the program, and voila, right? And then conservation would be achieved. But in reality, it doesn't always work like that. So think of a scenario in which the people that own the land actually own a hill, and on the lowest part of that hill, they want to chop down the forest so they can grow corn. right? And so what ends up happening is that they enroll the other part of the land that they were not going to deforest in the first place, right? And so money exchanges hands, and you know, and these folks end up paying vast sums of cash in some instances to conserve a part that, you know, perhaps we're going to be conserved either way, right? And so there's this question of additionality. Is this program providing results that would have happened in the absence of the program? You know what I mean? So is this money being invested so that this is no? Oh, yeah, sorry about that. So what is yeah, so the question of additionality, right? And so this is where adverse selection arises, and economists talk about this all the time in the context of program for ecosystem payment for ecosystem service programs, and it's this thing where, you know, we end up investing in places that have the lowest opportunity cost of other land uses, right? And so there's very little additionality, and this usually happens because there's difference in the information that these folks have and these folks have. Like, they don't know that these guys are going to be enrolling their land with the lowest opportunity cost, if that makes sense. So far, are we doing good? Yes? Okay, good. And I like this framework as a PhD student because it really resonated with what was happening in the Chaco forest in Argentina. So for those of you that don't know about the Chaco forest, it's the second largest forest in the Americas. It's a dry forest, so think of dense understory, thorny, you know, large trees, lots of understories, but then it's been wiped off at a tremendous rate. So deforestation rates are going through the roof. As you can see here, this was a 2013 paper, very, very well known, the Hansen et al. And it shows here in red where you have deforestation hotspots, and you can see Southeast Asia, part of the Amazon, and of course the Chaco here, and their paper shows that it has one of the largest deforestation rates in the world. So this is where I started thinking, you know, maybe PES can actually help understand this problem, right? And it's an interesting framework because not only is the government investing a lot in this program, but also the World Bank, for example, is investing a lot of money in this program, which I'm going to tell you in a second. And it's critical because there are plenty of indigenous communities and local people that depend on the forest and also wildlife, right? And so if we can have oh, and here's my dog. If we can have a system in which we can have effective forest conservation and provision of ecosystem services in private lands, this would be amazing, right? And so let's go back to the Argentine PES, and I'm going to tell you why I think this is a PES. So in the face of all this deforestation, what happened in Argentina was in 2007 they passed a forest law, right? And the law, in my view, in my opinion at least, it has two main components. It has a land use zoning component and a payment component. So the land use zoning component established that all native forests were going to have to be classified into one of three categories: red, yellow, or green, just like a traffic light, right? So you can think of red as in stop, you can't deforest here, this is the most valuable land that we have for conservation, you cannot deforest these lands. And then yellow, we're also gonna avoid deforestation, but you can do some things. There are some land uses that are allowed, like you can do sustainable cattle ranching, you can do sustainable timber, you can do ecotourism. Ecotourism you can also do in red, but you can do, you know, some land use activities that have a relatively low impact for biodiversity. And then you have the green areas, which are supposed to be the least important areas for conservation, right? And so since Argentina is a federal country, each province did its own land use zoning system. So it's funny, you can see some discrepancies. Like if you look at this border here in Salta, it's yellow, but on the other province it's green. So what happened there is it's a very, very interesting change in ecological conditions, right? But no, that's just a result of different priorities in different provinces. And then you could look at the agricultural potential of that land. So that's what I'm showing here. I'm showing 4 provinces in the north of Argentina that hold Chaco forest in Argentina, and then this map here shows the agricultural potential that you can view as as almost as a proxy of the land that would have greatest deforestation threat, right? Because the land that you can grow, you know, soybeans or that is very apt for cattle grazing, that's usually the land that's going to be deforested first. And then since this program is voluntary, then people are going to enroll just anywhere. If you have a piece of land and it has some native forest and you fall in either one of these zones, that you can definitely enroll your land. And so the condition here is that each participant needs to present a forest use plan. Like, what are they going to do with the money that they're going to get? And so it's conditional on that plan. And that's why we argue that this is, in fact, a payment for ecosystem service program, because even though you have a land use zoning system, but you also have this voluntary transaction that is conditional on supplying some sort of conservation product. So far, how are we doing so far? Any questions so far? Are we good? Okay. Oh, hold on. Let me see. There is a chat. Great. Good. Okay, good. Thank you. And so if you think of this program, you can think of sort of a framework that can help you analyze and sort of use a lens through which you can look at this program. Because on the one hand, you have the conservation threat of a location. So if you remember these orange spots for each one of those lands, you can think of the conservation threat of that location. It can be low or it can be high. And also the contract length. So each participant can choose to enroll for, say, a year, or maybe they can choose to enroll for 20 or 30 years, right? So that's one of the difference in comparison to other payment for ecosystem service programs where they have fixed amount of times. Here, the contract length is negotiated with each person that enrolls the program. And so if you look at the combination of these things, you can think of the most desired outcome, which would be enrolling places that have high threat of conversion for a long time, right? And I think that makes sense and resonates with most of us. And the worst thing that could happen is short-term enrollment of places that have a low threat of conversion. Why is this bad? Well, because you're just wasting money on places that would be conserved even in the absence of this program. So this is your garden variety adverse selection. But then you can also think of adverse selection in space or time, right? So enrolling sort of crappy land for long periods of time, or the other extreme, which be to enroll places with low threats of conversion for long periods of time, right? And so this framework was very useful to us because we could look at not only the spatial patterns of enrollment, but also the temporal patterns. And I think this was critical. And I still remember when I was in Rob's office and we were looking at this, and then suddenly we stand up and he draws in the whiteboard of in his office, and we started doing this little graph here, and I thought that helped us understand the problem, or at least give us a different lens to which we could look at this problem. So we wanted to ask is if we had adverse selection in the Argentine Payment for Ecosystem Service Program. And also we wanted to know if long-term enrollment of lands with high conversion risk was attained by this program, right? And so in order to look at this question of ag suitability and enrolled and not enrolled land, we hit the jackpot, really, because at the beginning of my study, I was thinking about going into the field and sort of interviewing people and try to get information as much as we could. But then one day, a friend of mine told me, hey, you know what? All this information is centralized in the Ministry of Environment. So you can just write them an email and they'll share the data with you. And that was amazing. That was fantastic. So I had data on absolutely all program participants. You want to come here? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. It's going to help me give this talk. So you had data on all program participants. And so what we did is we generated a random sample of non-participant locations. So that way we could compare the participants against the non-participants in terms of the agricultural suitability. And so we used a logistic regression model to test the probability of participating as a function of ag suitability to see if there were any differences there. And also we wanted to compare ag suitability in places that enroll for short periods of time and long periods of time, thinking about that temporal aspect of adverse selection. And we looked at the duration of enrollment as a function of ag suitability info. And so when we did our analysis, and we wanted to see if there was adverse selection, I was expecting a big yes, but it turns out that no. In fact, our results show that there were, both things were happening. There was some enrollment in places with very low deforestation threat, but also in places with very high deforestation threat. So there were no clear patterns there. So I thought that was interesting and very, very good news. But then when we looked at enrollment length, that's when it was a completely eye-opening experience for us, because what we realized is that landowners with better land for agriculture, right? So we're looking at this end, were enrolling for shorter periods of time. That land was less productive than enrollees with less productive land. And you can see this pattern here. There's so many more dots here in places with low agricultural potential enrolled for long periods of time, right? And this was super interesting for us, because it made us think that we actually were having evidence of temporal adverse selection, which to us it was cool and it was new, and this pattern was very consistent across. I can put your faces here at the bottom. Oh, that's useful. So this pattern was very consistent across all provinces and in different land use zones. And the one cool thing that we saw was the province of Chaco. So from the 4 provinces that I showed you guys, the province of Chaco showed the most dramatic evidence of temporal adverse selection in both red and green. But then in yellow, they showed a completely different pattern, as you can see here. And so why was that? And it turns out that that when we looked at the data a little bit closer, Chaco has a legislation that allows for more land clearing in yellow areas. So I think you can deforest, if I remember correctly, you can deforest up to 20% of your land, and then use up to 60% of your land for cattle grazing. And so that makes sense, because if you give landowners the choice of enrolling in a program while also conducting activities that allow them to earn money, then they'll jump on board. And I think that's what explains this pattern here in yellow. And so what have we learned in that first article, or that first experience? Well, we learned that adverse selection can occur in space, but also in time. And this changed fundamentally our way of thinking about this problem. And so for us, it was super important. And also the fact that we got evidence, because if you look at just the spatial patterns, you would think that, well, the program's working, right? But if you look at the temporal pattern, then you start seeing that this program needs some changes, right? So that the money that we're investing in these forests is has a greater effect. And also we saw some very interesting trends in the yellow category, especially in the Chaco province. Why? Well, just as I explained, I think it has to do with the fact that yellow allows for some activities that allow people to make a little bit more money, and so sort of it's a stick but also a carrot. And we also wanted, we wondered whether these trends were driven by cattle ranchers. So we wanted to look a little bit more in depth in terms of who were these people, right? Because again, you have all these enrollees enrolling in different parts, and we know that each location has different agricultural potential and therefore different deforestation pressure. But what's happening in each one of those points? Who are they? And so that was a big challenge. And so after I graduated, we started thinking about this, and we were talking about this a lot with Christina, and also Josh Hiller, who was also at that point, he was a PhD student in the math department, and thinking of different ways in which we could try to estimate who were those guys based on different stuff and models. But then the good thing is that I had a secret weapon. That secret weapon was Christina. And if you know Christina, aside from the fact that she's fantastic, but she also worked at a bank, right? And so Christina told me, well, you know what? You actually can get more information than you think you can. So there's this database that we used in the bank all the time that you can log in and get everyone's information, because there's a Free of Information Act or something here. And you can get information about people in terms of what are their main economic activities, where do they live, and all that good stuff, right? Hold on. Is there a correlation between agriculture potential and the green, yellow, and red zoning? Oh, great question. And what we found was that so the data was not, the analysis didn't show a statistically strong difference between red, yellow, and green. And mainly because there's a lot of variability. So you can see the confidence intervals here being very, very big, and also different provinces doing different things. So I think that's why we couldn't pick up on a statistically strong signal. But you can see that yellow has a different behavior than the red and the green. So yeah, if you ask me, I think I think that this part here that's happening in yellow is really interesting. And the other interesting thing is that we are getting enrollment in green. So remember, green are the zones where you can deforest everything if you want. Well, not everything. You have to leave some forest strips, but you could potentially just clear your land and have soybean, right? So the fact that we're seeing enrollment in green, then that's super cool. So that was exciting for us. And so then going back to what Christina was saying is that, you know, this tax ID data set where you can have the main economic activity information, you can know whether the landowners are local or absentee, right? So are these people that, for example, live in Buenos Aires or in, I don't know, Switzerland, but they invest in land in the middle of the Chaco forest, which is happening a lot. And also you can look at the gender, you can look at a whole suite of very interesting stuff. And to give you guys an idea of what we had to do, so we had the PES data set, which on itself was fantastic, right? And we had a tax ID and the amount of money, the amount of land that they enroll and all that stuff. So we had to make it sort of talk with this governmental tax ID data set that it's only online. So we could, with the tax ID, we could match this and extract economic activity. And we needed to do this for the 1,400 data points that we had. And so it was a big task. Fortunately, at that point, I was collaborating with Shar Siddiqui. Some of you may know her. She's also fantastic. She gave us a huge hand in this. This took, I think, better part of a year to finish this, and then another big chunk to clean it and do all that stuff. But after that, we got a whole lot more information. So again, if you remember this sort of parameter space, if you will, we have contract length, and hold on, let me move these pictures here. Yeah, so contract length here and agriculture potential on the x-axis. You could look at how each participant falls in this parameter space, and suddenly you can get a lot more information. You can see, well, first of all, what type of land use plans are they submitting? Are they submitting conservation plans, non-timber forest product, or silviculture plans, or restoration plans, or silvopastoral projects? So we had a lot of information, the amount of size of land, whether these folks were local or absentees. And so once we had this and the framework from the previous study, then we could gain even more information in terms of what is driving these patterns. And so that's what we did. We used a multinomial logistic regression model, which basically takes each one of those categories as a response variable, and it models it as a function of these other things. You know, are you, what's your main economic activity? Are you a rancher? Or maybe you own a bookstore, but you just invested land, or maybe you're just a lawyer, or you're an indigenous community that owns the land, so we have that information. And also for each point, what type of plan are they submitting to this program? Is it a timber forest, is it a timber operation? Is it a cattle ranching with forest? Or is it just conservation? Or maybe it's restoration? And also whether the landowners were absentee or local. And of course, the size of land. So now what we did is we used the conceptual framework from the first study and to see if we can gain a deeper understanding with this data set that we built by cross-referencing the PES data set with the tax ID government data set. And this is when we started getting more cool, other results that are also really cool. First, we noticed that and this was bad news, sort of, you know, conservation and restoration projects, which arguably are the most important for ensuring the long-term provision of ecosystem service in the Chaco. Well, these have higher probability of experiencing spatial temporal adverse selection than restoration and silvicultural projects. So what does this mean? That conservation and restoration projects are being enrolled in the most crappy places for short periods of time. So we're wasting money, and we're not achieving a lot in terms of conservation. So that was really bad news. And this was independently of the main economic activity. So this was a surprise. I was expecting a big signal to occur, but apparently the economic activity doesn't have to do with what people do with their land, which is interesting on its own. But also the other cool thing that we found out was that absentee landowners have a higher probability of experiencing spatial temporal adverse selection than local landowners. So this is great, because we know that if we want to discourage adverse selection, that we know that we either have to encourage enrollment of local landowners, or do something with absentee landowners to make them want to conserve places that are critical for conservation, right? And so far, what have we learned? Well, first, that local landowners seem to be important. So we know that the Argentine PES program is not perfect by any means, but from a legal standpoint, is a fantastic piece of legislation that at least is getting us a little bit closer to what we want in terms of forest conservation. And we're starting to see what can we possibly do to change it so that it can work a little bit better. So we know that local landowners are important. And interestingly enough, indigenous and campesinos and governmental organizations submitted large proportion of conservation and restoration projects. And if you think about this trend, it's also interesting because traditionally, at least in Argentina, the indigenous communities are not inhabiting the lands that they were occupying, you know, in historical times. They've been kicked out of their lands and put in other places, right, that are usually less productive. But the fact that these places are still important for conservation is super important. So we found that result very interesting. Something else that we learned was that smaller parcels have a lower likelihood of incurring adverse selection than large parcels. This is bad news from a standpoint of forest fragmentation, because if mainly the small parcels are the parcels that are saving the spots with you know, large deforestation threats, then that means that at the end of the day, you're going to have a landscape where the only places that are protected are these small fragments, and we all know what that does to connectivity, just functioning of forests. I mean, that's really bad news. So we need to fix that. And also, we realize that land uses that allow for additional financial activities seem to attract enrollment of threatened lands for longer periods of time, and this becomes very relevant in the face of expansion of extensive cattle ranching, and forgive the typo there, in the forest. And the reason why I'm saying this is in Argentina, and just like I'm sure it's happening in different places, there's this big push to implement cattle ranching in forest. And if you compare it to complete deforestation, I'm sure that that's an excellent option. But we don't know exactly how biodiversity will respond. We don't know exactly how the functioning of the forest will respond to this way. So on the one hand, I think it's important that we know that if you allow people to have financial activities that will give them a little bit more money and also participate in this program, you know, that's actually good. But we need to know more, because if you think about it for a second, the way it's happening, at least here in Salta, they're thinking about turning a place that looks kind of like this into an open savanna where you only have large trees and then you have planted pastures, right? And there you would have your cattle. So, I mean, you don't have to be an ecologist to look at how different these two places are. And also, if you have your cows and your livestock grazing here, then how is forest regeneration going to occur here if you're taking out all the small little trees because it's being outcompeted by grass, or it's being just wiped out when all this is burned out, you know? And so those are serious concerns that we have. Fortunately, there's a group in Tucumán that is looking into this very seriously. And also, we want to know how can we encourage more long-term conservation and restoration projects. So going back to that figure, if we can remember the map with all the dots, you know, each one of those points is a decision maker, and he or she or they enroll or not enroll, and there's just a decision process. So what's happening at that level? Fortunately, Christina's finishing her PhD and she's tackling a lot of these questions, and so I'm really looking forward to reading her dissertation, because I think it's going to give us the type of information that we need so that we can fix this project, this program. Oh, hold on, there's another question. High carbon stocks but low biodiversity in this. Yes, high carbon stock but low biodiversity. Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is where trade-off analysis, I think, come into place, right? And also long-term cycles, because maybe in the short term you have high carbon stocks, but I wonder how that's going to be sustained in the long run, where you're interrupting some of those ecological processes like forest restoration and all that good stuff, right? And what does that do to the whole climate change? So when I was in Arizona for my postdoc, I worked on a project dealing with ecoclimate teleconnections, and how the fact that if you change the surface of a place, that has a tremendous impact in terms of climate because of surface reflectance, right? And so you're just messing up with climate, and it's just a big mess. So yeah, absolutely. And so at this point, I'd like to stop and ask for questions. And also I want to acknowledge my collaborators and the University of Arizona, and of course SNRE at UF, and of course TCD Wildlife Conservation Department, and the Ruford Foundation. And also, this is another good chance for you to practice your print screen capabilities. If you want to hear more about what we're doing in the first long-term field research station in the Chaco, let me know. And with that, I'll just stop and try to answer your questions.